The hall was very old. It had been built long before humans ever looked up at the stars and wondered what lived out there. Its walls were made of a dark stone that no one remembered the name of anymore, and the ceiling was so high that the lights near the top were just tiny dots of white in the dark. The Galactic Council had been meeting in that hall for over 3,000 years, and in all that time, not one war had started inside it. That was the thing the Council was most proud of. Vreth walked slowly through the side corridor that led to the main floor, his long fingers trailing along the cold wall. He was Keth, one of the oldest species in the Council, and his body was thin and pale green, built for the wet, cool world he came from. His eyes were large and yellow, and they moved independently of each other, which always made the younger species uncomfortable. He did not mind. He had lived for 212 years, and he had long ago stopped caring about what made others uncomfortable. The emergency session had been called that morning. Not a regular session, an emergency one. That alone told Vreth everything he needed to know about the mood in the hall. He took his seat at the great curved table and looked at the others already sitting there. The Dren, with their thick brown hides and slow eyes. The Sorvathi, thin and blue, clicking their small mouth parts together. The Urlai, who had no real mouths at all, and communicated by pressing glowing patches on their skin together. And at the far end, the humans. There were 4 of them. A woman with short dark hair and a scar along her jaw that looked like it had come from fire. 2 men beside her, both younger, both watching the room with quiet, careful eyes. And behind them, almost hidden in the shadow, a 4th person, who was looking at something on a small screen and writing things down. Vreth knew the woman, Admiral Sarah Okafor. He had seen her 3 times before in council chambers, though she had never said much at any of those meetings. She was small for a human, which already said very little, because humans were small compared to most species. But she sat straight in her chair, and her hands were still on the table. And there was something about the way she sat that made him look at her for a moment longer than he meant to. She looked calm. The session opened, and the first speaker was the Dren representative, a heavy old male named Brat Kezan, who had been saying the same kinds of things in council meetings for 40 years. He spoke about the Vorath swarm. The Vorath. Vreth closed his large eyes for just a moment. 3 weeks ago, a Vorath swarm had broken through the defense line at the outer rim. Not one ship, not a scouting party, a full swarm, the kind that ate everything in its path and moved on like a fire through dry grass. The colony at Paris 4 was gone. Not defeated, not damaged, gone. The colony at Senna Station was gone. The military outpost at Reach 7, also gone. No survivors. No transmissions after contact. Just silence where there used to be voices. Brat Kezan was saying that the council needed to consider a careful response. He used the word careful many times. He talked about not making the situation worse, about not provoking a greater attack, about studying the swarm's movement patterns before committing any forces. He was a good speaker. He always sounded like the most reasonable person in the room, even when what he was saying was nothing at all. The Sorvathi representative spoke next, and said that negotiation had worked once with a minor swarm 3 centuries ago, and that perhaps something similar could be attempted. Several other delegates nodded. The Uli flashed a pattern that the translation unit rendered as, "We support a cautious approach." Vreth listened. He watched, and all the time he was watching, he found his eyes drifting back to the humans. Admiral Okafor had not moved. She was not looking at the speakers. She was looking at the table in front of her. And her face was still. And she was thinking about something that had nothing to do with what was being said in the room. Vreth had been in council long enough to recognize the look. It was not boredom. It was patience. The kind of patience that comes from already having made a decision and waiting for everyone else to finish talking. He found that slightly unsettling, though he was not sure why. The session ran for 6 hours. At the end of it, the council had agreed to form a committee to study the situation, to send 2 scout ships to the edge of the affected zone, and to hold another session in 4 days. They had agreed, in other words, to wait. It was, Vreth reflected, what the council did best. It had survived 3,000 years by being very good at waiting. As the session ended, and the delegates began to move toward the doors, Vretsal found himself walking near the human group. He was not trying to. His path simply took him that way. And as he passed, he heard Okafor speak quietly to the young man at her side. "Tell the fleet," she said. Her voice was low. It was not a whisper. She was not hiding what she was saying. She simply did not need to say it loudly. "Begin pre-charge protocols, all ships." The young man nodded once, and moved away, already pressing something on his wrist. Vretsal slowed. He wanted to ask what pre-charge protocols meant. He wanted to ask who she had been speaking to, and how many ships she meant, and what exactly she was planning. But by the time he turned, she was already walking in the other direction, her boots quiet on the old stone floor. He stood there for a moment in the emptying hall, and told himself it was nothing. She was probably just running a routine exercise. Humans were always running exercises. They were a nervous species, still young, still learning how things worked out here, among the older civilizations. They probably did not fully understand the weight of what the swarm meant. That was what he told himself. But that night, sitting in his quarters with a cup of warm mineral water and the soft blue glow of the station lights outside his window, he thought about the way she had looked in that meeting. Still, calm, certain. And he thought 2 days passed. The Vorath swarm moved deeper into Council space, and nobody stopped it. The 2 scout ships the Council had sent came back with data. The data was not good. The swarm was larger than first thought. It was moving faster than the models had predicted. And it was not spreading out in the way that swarms usually did. It was staying tight, moving like a fist rather than a flood. That meant it had a direction. That meant it had a target. Vretsal read the data 3 times in his quarters before the morning session. Then he sat very still for a while, with the screen dark in his hands, and looked at the wall. The second session was worse than the first. More voices, more talking, more words that added up to nothing. The Dren wanted to build a new defense line at the inner rim. The Sorvathi said that would take 8 months, and the swarm would be through in 6. The Uli flashed something that the translation unit could not fully interpret, but that seemed to mean something close to, "We are not certain any of this matters." Vretsal watched the humans again. Okafor was sitting in the same seat as before. Same posture, same stillness. But there was something different this time. The young aide who had been behind her was gone. In his place was an older man with a tight gray uniform and a small earpiece in his left ear. He was leaning forward slightly, and every few minutes he would turn his head just a little, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The meeting broke for a midday interval. Most delegates went to the side rooms to eat or rest. Vretsal was walking toward the water station when he passed close to the human corner of the hall, and he heard the gray-uniformed man speaking in a low, flat voice into his earpiece. "All groups confirmed," the man was saying. "Fleet is at 73% pre-charge. Estimated full readiness in 14 hours. Vretsal kept walking. He did not stop, but his large yellow eyes had gone very still, and his fingers were cold. "Fleet," the man had said, "fleet." How large a fleet? That evening, Vretsal did something he had not done in a long time. He called in a favor. He had an old contact in the Council's sensor monitoring division, a Sorvathi female named Fess, who had worked the long-range feeds for 30 years, and who owed him a small but real debt from a political vote 6 years ago. He asked her quietly to check the movement logs for human-registered drive signatures in the surrounding sectors. Fess called him back in 2 hours. Her voice was strange when she spoke. "How many would you expect?" she asked him. "A few," he said. 12 perhaps. 20 at most. Humans keep a small patrol presence near Council space." There was a pause. Vretsal, Fess said, "I am reading 462 human drive signatures. And that number is growing. They are all converging on the same point. They are moving at maximum burn. He did not speak for a moment. Where are they going? He finally asked. Directly toward the Vorath swarm, she said. They will reach contact range in approximately 31 hours. The next morning was when the panic started. It began small. A sensor operator in the monitoring suite ran a standard sweep, and saw the signatures, and did not know what they were, and flagged them as unknown. His supervisor came over, looked at the screen, and thought they were a second enemy fleet, moving to flank the Council from the opposite direction. She hit the emergency alert without asking anyone. Within minutes, a third of Conclave Prime's non-essential personnel were trying to reach the evacuation lifts. Vreth Sol was already in the monitoring suite when the alert went out. He moved to the central display and studied it for 15 seconds, then raised his voice above the noise. These are human ships, he said clearly. Stand down the alert. The noise did not stop immediately. It took 2 more minutes, and one of the Council's security chiefs, physically moving people away from the lift doors, before things settled into something like order. But the panic did not go away entirely. It just changed shape. It became quieter, and it moved from the corridors into the meeting rooms and the private channels, and the faces of the delegates when they thought no one was looking at them. Vreth Sol called Okafor directly. She took the call from what appeared to be a room full of screens and moving maps, all of them showing positions and vectors and numbers he did not understand. Admiral, he said, perhaps you can explain what is happening. We are going to hit them, she said. She did not sound angry. She did not sound excited. She sounded like someone who had already spent a long time thinking about a problem and had arrived at an answer. The Vorath, he said. You are going toward the Vorath. Yes. Do you have a plan? She looked at him through the screen. Her scarred jaw was set, and her eyes were steady. We do, she said. It is called charging. He stared at her for a long moment. Admiral, every species that has engaged the swarm in open battle has been destroyed. The Vorath do not fight the way we fight. They surround, they overwhelm, they consume. You cannot simply run at them. I know, she said, and then before he could speak again. Vreth Sol, how long has the Council been studying the Vorath? Many centuries, he said. And how many times has the Council beaten them? He did not answer. We have been studying them for 30 years, she said. That's all we had. But we did not study them the same way. We did not study how to survive them. We studied how to break them. She paused. I have to go. Watch the feed. The call ended. Vreth Sol stood in the monitoring suite and looked at the 462 drive signatures, moving like a bright river across the long-range display. All of them rushing toward the thing that had already swallowed 3 colony systems whole. Behind him, he could hear other delegates coming in. He could hear their voices getting quieter as they saw what he was seeing. He could hear the Dren representatives say something to another in their own tongue that the translation unit did not catch, but the sound of it was enough. It was the sound of fear. Vreth Sol did not feel fear exactly. What he felt was something older and harder to name. It was the feeling of watching something happen that had never happened before, and not yet knowing whether it was going to be. Nobody slept much that night on Conclave Prime. The monitoring suite stayed open. The long-range sensor feeds ran without stopping. A few delegates left after midnight and went back to their quarters, but most of them came back within an hour. There was nowhere else to be. Whatever was going to happen, it was going to happen on those screens, and everyone who was there knew it. Vreth Sol did not leave at all. He sat in a chair near the back of the suite, and watched the display and drank 3 cups of something warm that a young Keth aide brought him without being asked. He was grateful for that, though he did not say so. The human fleet was visible as a cluster of bright points moving steadily across the map. 462 ships. Vreth Sol had quietly asked for a breakdown of the vessel types, and what he got back had surprised him. Not all warships. Many warships, yes, destroyers and fast carriers, and things that had no council equivalent, and whose function he could only guess at. But also other ships, heavier, slower, supply vessels, he thought at first. But their configurations were wrong for that. They were built differently, built for something specific. He did not know what yet. The Vorath swarm showed on the display as a dark mass. It was not dark because it was inactive. It was dark because the sensors could not fully count what was inside it. Thousands of Vorath units moved together as one thing, the way a school of fish moves. Not following orders, not thinking individually, just responding to the whole. The swarm was how the Vorath fought. It was how they had destroyed everything they had ever encountered. You could not cut it. You could not shoot a piece of it and hurt the rest. You could not outrun it. You could only be swallowed. It was one of the first things the Council had documented about the Vorath, hundreds of years ago. At 31 hours and 40 minutes after Vrethsal's conversation with Okafor, the human fleet reached the edge of the swarm. Vrethsal stood up without thinking about it. Around him, in the low light of the monitoring suite, he heard other people doing the same. The Sorvathi delegate, a female named Wen Sori, who was usually very composed, said quietly, "They are not slowing down." She was right. The human fleet did not slow down. It did not stop to form a defensive line. It did not spread out into an encirclement pattern. It did not do any of the things that every tactical model the Council had ever built said you had to do, if you wanted to survive contact with a Vorath swarm. It hit the swarm at full speed. For the first few seconds, the display was hard to read. The sensor data was coming in faster than the display could organize it, and the screen was full of movement and signal and noise. Vrethsal pressed closer to the display and squinted his large yellow eyes and tried to understand what he was seeing. The swarm had done what it always did. It had begun to close around the incoming fleet, pulling its outer units inward, beginning the long, slow process of surrounding and crushing. Every fleet that had ever entered a swarm had been caught in that process and ground apart. But the human fleet did not let it happen. They did not stop inside the swarm. They went through it. Not carefully, not tactically, they drove straight through at maximum burn, and came out the other side, and then they turned and did it again from a different angle. And then again. They were moving too fast for the swarm to close around them. They were punching holes in it. "They are fragmenting it," Vrethsal said, mostly to himself. "They will be destroyed," Brodkezin said beside him. The old Dren delegate's voice was shaking slightly. "You cannot run into a Vorath swarm and survive. It is not possible." "They are surviving," Vrethsal said. "Not all of them." He was right about that. The sensor data was showing losses. Human ships were dying. Not many at first, but as the minutes passed, the count climbed. 30 ships, 40, 50. Each one that disappeared from the display was a crew. Vrethsal did not let himself think about that too clearly, because if he did, he was not sure he could keep watching, and he needed to keep watching. What he was seeing began to make a strange kind of sense. The human fleet was not just charging blindly, it was splitting. The 462 ships separated into 6 groups, each one driving into a different section of the swarm, each one pulling the swarm's attention in a different direction. The swarm, which was built to surround a single point, was being pulled in 6 directions at once. And then he understood the heavy ships. The ones that were not quite supply vessels. They were not fighting. They were broadcasting. Large antenna arrays had extended from their hulls, and they were projecting something. A signal, a frequency that Vrethsal could not identify. But the effect was visible. Where the signal was strongest, the swarm moved differently, slower, less coordinated. Individual Vorath units began responding to their nearest neighbors, instead of to the swarm as a whole. Small sections began breaking off, drifting, acting without direction. "They found the frequency," Vrethsal said. His voice was very quiet. "They found the frequency the hive uses to communicate, and they are jamming it." Nobody in the room said anything. The display was alive with movement now. The great dark mass of the swarm was breaking apart at the edges, pulled by the 6 human strike groups, into something that was no longer one thing, but many smaller things. And smaller things could be fought. Smaller things could be chased. Smaller things did not surround you and swallow you whole. 80 human ships. 90. 104. Wen Sori turned away from the display. She was pressing her thin blue hands together, and her mouth parts were moving, but she was not making any sound. The Ulai representative had gone dark, all its light patches off, which Retzal had never seen before. And then a voice came over the monitoring suite's open channel. It was a transmission from the human flagship, broadcasting on a council-accessible frequency. The voice was Okafor's, and it was clear and steady and not loud at all. "All ships," she said. "We have them. The swarm is fragmenting on schedule. All strike groups, hold your vectors. Do not stop. Do not ever stop." And then the channel was full of static. Vretzal stood in the silence of the monitoring suite and watched the display and said nothing. Around him, he was aware that other people were not saying anything either. Some of them had sat back down, some were standing very still. On the screen, the human fleet kept moving. It did not stop. It did not slow. Even with 100 ships gone from the count, the remaining 358 kept driving forward, kept pushing, kept pulling the broken pieces of the swarm apart from each other. Vretzal thought about a word he had read once in a human history file. A very old word, from before humans had left their home world. The swarm broke at hour 19. Not all at once. It was not like a light going out. It was more like watching something very large and very sure of itself slowly realize that it was not sure of anything anymore. The outer sections of the swarm had already been cut off and scattered. The inner sections, which were supposed to be the strongest, had been pulled in so many directions at once that they had lost the shape that made them dangerous. The Vorath were still out there, still many thousands of individual units, but they were no longer one thing. They were pieces, and pieces could be hunted. The human fleet hunted them. Vretzal watched this part in silence, and it was the silence that told him something had changed in the room. Not the silence of shock, the way the room had gone quiet when the fleet first hit the swarm. This was a different kind of silence. Quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that comes when you are watching something that you do not have words for yet. The council delegates in the monitoring suite, representatives of dozens of species, old ones and young ones, warriors and diplomats and scientists, were watching the human fleet move through the broken swarm and not speaking. Some had stopped watching the tactical display and were watching the transmission feeds instead. Direct footage from human ship cameras, transmitted back to Conclave Prime on a public channel. The footage was shaky and dark, and sometimes cut out entirely when a ship took a hit, but it kept coming back. You could see in the footage how fast the human ships moved, how they did not circle or hesitate at the edges of a Vorath concentration. They went straight in, every time. There was something almost mechanical about it, not cold, not unfeeling, but fixed, determined in a way that went past decision-making into something more like nature. "They are still taking losses," Bratkezin said. He was sitting now. He looked tired. "That is more than a quarter of their fleet." "Yes," Vretzal said, "and they are not stopping." "No." The old Dren was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why are they not stopping?" Vretzal did not answer, because the honest answer was that he did not fully know yet. He had a feeling about it, something forming in the back of his long memory, but it was not clear enough yet to say out loud. Meanwhile, the council was falling apart in other ways. The emergency session had been called again, and had broken down twice already. The first time, the Dren delegation had gotten into an argument with the Sorvathi about whether the human fleet's actions were authorized by council rules of engagement. They were not authorized. Humans had not asked anyone's permission. The second breakdown came when 3 minor species submitted a joint motion, formally requesting that humanity be classified as a dangerous and unpredictable military power and placed under expanded monitoring. Vretzal heard about both of these things from Fess, who was still in the sensor room and was sending him brief messages every half hour. He read them and set his communicator down and kept watching the display. He understood the fear. It was real and it was not stupid. The council had spent 3,000 years building a careful set of rules about how military force was used among member species, and humanity had just assembled 462 warships without telling anyone and flown them directly into the largest active conflict zone in council space. From the outside, from the perspective of any species that was not currently being eaten by the Vorath, that looked like exactly the kind of thing the rules were supposed to prevent. And yet, at hour 22, the first pieces of the swarm began to retreat. Not the organized pulling back of a fleet regrouping. The frantic, scattered flight of individuals that had lost the connection to their whole. Single Vorath units, then small clusters, then larger fragments, all moving away from the human fleet in different directions. They were running. The Vorath swarm was running. Vrethsal had read every Vorath engagement report in the Council's database. He had read 3,000 years of records. In no record, in no report, in no historical account of any kind, had a Vorath swarm ever run from anything. He sat down heavily in his chair. The comms traffic from the human fleet started coming in more clearly now that the electronic noise of active combat was fading. The monitoring suite's operators were filtering it and displaying translated summaries on the side screens. Vrethsal read them as they came in. Strike Group 3 to Fleet Command. Sector clear, pursuing fragmented units northeast. Requesting resupply at coordinates attached. Medical Frigate Endurance to Fleet Command. We are at capacity. Diverting to staging point. Casualty count to follow. Strike Group 1 to all ships. Swarm signal on this vector is fully dark. Moving to support Group 5. They were organized. Even now, even after losing more than 100 ships, and fighting for nearly a full day, the messages were organized. Calm. Practical. The human fleet was not celebrating. It was not resting. It was doing the next thing on the list. A young Keth aide, the one who had brought Vrethsal his drinks through the night, leaned close to him and spoke quietly. "Counselor, are they not afraid of dying?" Vrethsal looked at the screens. He looked at the numbers. 131 ships lost by that point, and 331 still moving, still coordinated, still pushing. "They are," he said. He said it quietly and with certainty, because he had read enough human history to know it was true. That is precisely what makes them so terrifying. The aide did not say anything else. The Vorath retreat became a rout by hour 26. Large sections of the swarm were moving beyond sensor range. The human fleet gave pursuit to the nearest clusters and let the distant ones go, which was, Vrethsal noted, a tactically sound decision. You did not stretch a fleet that had taken heavy losses by chasing every fragment to the edge of the map. You secured the area. You let the broken pieces scatter. You made sure the threat was finished for now. By the time the Council's third emergency session of the day opened, the main swarm was gone. Vrethsal walked into the session hall and found it louder and more frightened than he had ever seen it. Not frightened of the Vorath anymore, frightened of the humans. He could see it in the way delegates were grouping themselves, in the quiet conversations that stopped when he walked by, in the two motions already submitted to the floor calling for emergency restrictions on human military activity in Council space. He took his seat and he looked at the humans across the table. Okafor was not there. She was still on her flagship. In her place was the gray-uniformed man with the earpiece, and he was reading something on a screen and did not look up when Vrethsal sat down. The noise in the hall was everywhere. Panic, Vrethsal thought. Panic had moved in from the corridors and taken a seat at the table. And then he thought, we are sitting here panicking about the species that just saved us, while the species that just saved us is writing damage reports. He pressed. 3 weeks later, the hall was quieter. The emergency sessions were over. The Vorath fragments that had scattered across the outer sectors were being tracked, and the human fleet was still out there, still moving, still hunting the larger clusters that had not gone far enough. The casualties had been counted, and the number was final. 147 human ships lost. Somewhere between 10 and 15,000 human men and women who had gone out on those ships and not come back. Vrethsal had spent most of the 3 weeks in his quarters, reading. He had read human history from the beginning, not the brief summaries the Council kept in its new species files, which were polite and short and missed almost everything important. He had found longer records, some of them translated, some of them raw and requiring a translation program running in the background, and he had read them the way he had not read anything in a very long time. Carefully, slowly, going back over sections he did not understand and reading them again. The history of humanity was, as far as he could tell, a history of things going very wrong and humans refusing to stay down. Ice ages, plagues that had killed a third of their population at a time, wars that had lasted decades and burned entire regions of their single small world, civilizations that had risen and collapsed and risen again in different forms. Every century of their recorded history contained at least one event that, had it happened to the Keth or the Dren or the Sorvathi, would have ended that species entirely. The Keth had nearly gone extinct once, 4,000 years ago, from a single disease. They had never fully recovered their former numbers. They had built very carefully after that, and they had never taken a risk they did not have to take. Humans seemed to take risks as naturally as breathing. And they had not just survived, they had come through each catastrophe changed, not broken, changed. Harder in some places, stranger in others, but always moving, always building the next thing, always looking at the ruin around them, and starting to count what was left and figure out what could be done with it. Vreth Sol put the last of the records down 3 days before the formal session, and sat very still for a long time. Then he began writing his address. The session to formalize humanity's elevation to senior council membership was smaller than the emergency sessions had been, but it was full. Every species had sent a representative, and most had sent their most senior one. The hall had been cleaned, and the old lights replaced with brighter ones, and for the first time in weeks, it looked like the hall Vreth Sol had walked through for 2 centuries, calm, formal, old. Okafor was there in person. She was sitting in the human delegation seats at the curved table, and she looked, Vreth Sol thought, exactly the same as she had looked in the first session. Same posture, same stillness. The medical brace on her left arm was the only thing that was different. Something had happened to it during the battle, he had heard, though she had apparently not mentioned it to anyone at the time. Her uniform was the same plain dark one she always wore. She had not dressed up for the occasion. The motion to elevate humanity passed. 31 votes for, 6 abstentions, and 1 formal note of concern submitted in writing by a small species called the Vron, who stated simply, "We do not yet understand them." Vreth Sol thought that was the most honest thing said in the hall all day. Then he was asked to speak. He stood, and the room went quiet, and he looked at his notes for just a moment, and then set them down. I have spent 30 years in this council, watching the human delegation sit at this table and say very little, he said. I thought I understood why. I thought they were quiet because they were young, because they were still learning how things worked among older civilizations, because they did not yet have much to contribute. He paused. I was wrong about all of it. They were quiet because they already knew what they were going to do, and they were waiting for the right moment to do it. I have spent 3 weeks reading their history, and I can tell you that this is not new behavior. It is very old behavior. It is what they have always done. He looked around the room. Every species at this table found its equilibrium at some point. A safe level of risk, a speed of progress that felt sustainable, a way of living in the universe that was careful enough to last. We all have that threshold. It is why we are still here. It is also, I think, why we did not know how to stop the Voroth. Because stopping the Voroth required someone who did not have a threshold. Someone who, when they lost 100 ships, wrote damage reports and kept going. Someone who had practiced that kind of endurance for so long that it was no longer a choice, it was simply who they were. He sat down. There was a long silence, and then the council president, a very old Ulai whose light patches moved in slow, deep patterns, indicated that the human delegation could respond if they wished. Okafor stood. She was not tall, but she stood straight, and when she spoke, her voice was clear. We are honored, she said. We have wanted to be full members of this council for a long time. We did not do what we did to earn that. We did it because if we had not, you were going to negotiate with something that does not negotiate. The Voroth do not want peace, they want consumption. Somebody had to go first, and we were ready. That's all. She was about to sit when Vretzal spoke. He had not planned to say anything more, but the question had been in his mind for 3 weeks and he found he could not leave without asking it. "Admiral," he said, "who taught you to do that? To charge like that? To keep going? To not stop even when the losses were that great? Who taught you?" Her scarred jaw was level, and her eyes were thoughtful, and she took a moment before she answered. "No one," she said. "We figured it out the hard way. We always figure it out the hard way." She sat down. The session moved on to other business after that. Logistics, protocols, the formal paperwork of membership, and Vretzal let it wash over him. He was thinking about what she had said. No one. We figured it out the hard way. He thought about the ice ages, and the plagues, and the wars. He thought about a species that had been hit so many times, and in so many ways that hitting back had become instinct. He thought about the Vorath swarm, the thing that had destroyed everything it ever touched, running from ships that had already lost more than a quarter of their fleet. After the session ended, Vretzal walked back to his quarters slowly. He stopped once, at the long window that looked out over the station's exterior, and the stars beyond it. Somewhere out there, the human fleet was still moving, still working. He could not see it, but he knew it was there. He went to his desk and opened the personal record he had kept for 200 years, a daily log of observations, thoughts, things he wanted to remember. He had not written in it during the 3 weeks of research. Now he opened a new entry, and wrote, in the careful script of the Keth language, the one sentence he had been turning over in his mind since the night the swarm broke. "Watch them, learn from them, and pray you never have to face them as an enemy." He closed the record, and turned off the light and sat for a while in the dark, with the stars outside his window, and the quiet of the old station around him. Out in the deep